I'm Cy Kellett, the host of Catholic Answers Live, the radio show where we take calls from anyone with any question at all about the Catholic faith. We've gathered some of the conversations occasioned by those calls here for you. Our own apologist, Jimmy Akin, our president, Christopher Check, and our chaplain, Father Hugh Barber, discuss a bunch of saints today: St. Francis de Sales, young St. Agnes, and St. Timothy. And we get a great answer from Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse about how the redefinition of marriage has hurt society. We're glad you're with us. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. President Chris Check.
Host Cy Kellett.
This is St. Francis de Sales, well-known spiritual guide, director, as a matter of fact, virtually flawless spiritual guide and an assistant to so many other saints since his death.
His introduction to the devout life is surely among the top 10, if not top 5, most famous works of spiritual direction. But he's the popularizer of the devout life in many ways.
Right.
That the devout life is not simply the preserve of the monk or the nun in the cloister, but for all of us.
But you say we should also remember him as a great apologist.
He is one of the champions of apologetics. Shortly after he was ordained, he made his way into Le Chablais, which is a region at the time. So we're talking about the very end of the 16th century, around 1598, I think. And Le Chablais is at that time it's part of the Duchy of Savoy. But just think about where Switzerland, France, and Italy meet. Now this is the bloody crossroads of the wars of religion, particularly of John Calvin.
Yeah.
Right? And in fact, at one point, de Sales refers to Calvin as a stinker,
which is
in an
probably the most
moment.
apt description of John Calvin ever. He was a stinker.
Yeah, it's probably the nicest thing you could say. But in any case,
but virulent anti-Catholic.
Oh, to be sure,
So
and created this sort of Calvinist police state. And, just
right.
Really an awful guy. Anyway, shortly after de Sales is ordained. And this was a man who had all kinds of promise in the legal and the business world and this sort of thing. And his father didn't support his ordination. But shortly after he's ordained, so in the very beginning of his career as a priest, accompanied only by his cousin, Louis de Sales, they make their way into the Chablais. And like I say, his father doesn't support him, doesn't give him any money for the mission. And they have to stay on the edge of town because of how hostile the region is to Catholics. And there are the capital city is called Toulon, and there are maybe, I don't know, hundreds
of Catholics left.
just a few, right? Who haven't had the sacraments, who haven't had the Mass, who haven't had the benefit of clergy, right? They're kind of just sort of making their way as best they can in this Calvinist police state. And he makes his way in there every day, 10 miles in, 10 miles out, sometimes walking in the snow, bloody footprints in the snow, attacks by wolves, right? Bands of robbers. And he makes his way in, and one at a time, he begins to slide his tracks. So he's very early Carl Keating. Right?
Yeah, right. Here you go.
Sliding his tracks under the doors. And then he will have an apologetic conversation, right? He was Trent Horn. He'll have an apologetic conversation with anyone there in Toulon, whether it's some Calvinist minister or some doctor of the law or some laborer. And he starts one by one, kind of like Speaker's Corner, right? Like Vincent McNabb at Speaker's Corner, getting up, preaching, giving apologetic defense, answering question and answers. This goes on for a couple of years, maybe, a handful of conversions. And
that part is both incredibly impressive and terrifying.
It is.
That's the requirement. That's what's needed to plant the seeds of the faith again once they've been scattered.
And it's something Americans really ought to meditate on because we like to measure success.
Yeah,
a lot. And we like to look.
We like to have programs and
the
charts,
the quarterly report. Exactly right. We're interested. And Canon Louis, his cousin, gets very discouraged. He says, "This is not working, Francis. Why are we doing this?" And he says, Louis, we've planted the seeds, right? And now God is going to bring forth the harvest. And by the third year, the conversions start to come, and in the thousands, right? He later describes it, the vines overflowing, like, with the grapes and the perfume coming from the grapes, and he restores Catholicism to this very contentious region of Europe.
And that book.
My dear friend Chris Bloom at the Augustine Institute brought the Sign of the Cross out in English for the first time about 5 years ago. I wrote the foreword, and this book on the Sign of the Cross came out of this apologetic adventure.
Mm-hmm.
There was one incident in particular where he was treating publicly with the Calvinist ministers, and the question of the Sign of the Cross came up, and this book came out in English. People should get it from Sophia Institute Press. It's superb.
They do beautiful books, Sophia Institute Press.
They do.
But
Chris did a superb job translating it.
I think, because I read the foreword you wrote, that the lesson you take from this is, if you intend to share Christ as an apologist, or maybe in any capacity, make sure you are tending to your own being conformed to Christ.
Your interior life. Dom Chotard in Solo the Apostolate tells this very story of Francis de Sales in the Chablais. And the other thing, Cy, we do what we do out of love of Jesus Christ, and we leave the outcome to God.
Praise God.
That's how we measure. That's how Catholics measure success.
Right.
We leave the outcome to God.
St. Francis de Sales, pray for us.
Praise God.
Thank you, Chris. Father Hugh, I want to talk to you a little bit about St. Agnes. Saint, martyred at the age of 12. That's pretty darn impressive. How do you get to be a saint at the age of 12?
Well, of course, she was martyred on January 21st. That's why her feast day is coming up. That's why we're talking about her. And she consecrated her virginity to the Lord and refused an arranged marriage, and therefore was brought before the tribunal, and they tried to force her into the marriage. She refused, and so they condemned her to a brothel, where the Lord miraculously protected her modesty by allowing her hair to grow so much that it covered her body, according to the tradition. You can see the beautiful relief of that event in the Church of San Agnese in Agone in Rome, there on Piazza Navona. And but then finally they tried with fire, and then finally by beheading to take her life, and they did. And there are two very important churches in honor of St. Agnes in Rome. And she is among the Virgin Martyrs, of which there are a number, the most important for the Roman tradition. So important that in the Roman liturgy, traditionally, all the way through the 62 Missal that we had before the new one, there was a kind of an octave of St. Agnes. There was her feast day on the 21st, and then on the 28th, there was a second commemoration of St. Agnes. So she was like St. Lawrence, the first martyr deacon. Those are the two kind of martyr saints that the Roman Church venerates, especially. Agnes and Lawrence are kind of a balance. Lawrence is in August, Agnes is in July. She was especially venerated. Now, this has to do with what I like to call sometimes liturgical astrology. Not that it's like astrology that's bad or anything like that, but that the conjunction of certain spiritual realities united to the liturgy can be a very interesting thing. So we have the Feast of St. Agnes on the 21st and her second commemoration on the 28th. And then we have Vatican II intervening, and the calendar is all
tidied up.
Now, there's a saint in the calendar. They mostly, the biggest change they made was to try to move as many saints as possible outside of Lent, so that the readings and the prayers of Lent would be mostly those of Lent. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas was in Lent. He died on March 7th.
Right.
And they had to move him out of Lent. Where did they move him? Well, they found the date of the translation of his relics from Fossa Nova near Naples to Toulouse in France in the 14th century. So they picked that. That's a traditional day also to celebrate a saint's feast day, the translation. So they found that new feast day, the 28th of January, and they moved him to Toulouse. And then they put his feast day in the calendar there on the 28th of January. But I don't think they were thinking of the fact that in heaven, the two of them had conspired
to make that happen.
That with his devotion to her, which I will describe in a moment, that they would manage to conserve the heavenly celebration of her second commemoration by making it his. It's very sweet.
Now, she, just to be clear, she was martyred in about the year 304.
Right.
And that is just before Christianity becomes legally tolerated in Roman society. Thomas lived
1,000 years later.
1,000 years later. Yeah. Okay, and so what's their connection?
Well, St. Thomas was particularly devoted to St. Agnes, and he wore, pinned inside his habit, not one but two relics of her. And this is a nice thing for us who think of St. Thomas as just this big theological brain, not much associated with popular devotion and whatnot, but he had this great personal devotion to St. Agnes, so much so that according to his canonization testimonies, on her feast day, he used money donated by his family to adorn her altar with more flowers and to give to the confreres larger portions of wine and other nice things on her feast day.
So somehow she was his friend.
Yeah, and St. Thomas teaches that the saints have an influence which is more or less universal according to their role. And what's intriguing about this is that this virgin martyr, who was no theologian, was no student, was not wise in the ways of the world at all, but was a pure virgin, praised by St. Ambrose in his homilies on her, that she became his special patron. And that's borne out because when he needed to combat the secular clergy who were opposing the presence of religious professors in the University of Paris, he had to engage in public disputations against them, and for those he composed his Contra Impugnantes de Cultum et Religionem, against those who attack the worship of God and his true religion.
You don't have to translate for me, Father.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Anyway. So he was, the night before he was supposed to engage in the disputation, he got a horrible toothache.
Oh.
Just a dreadful toothache that made his whole mouth swell and made it impossible for him to speak.
Oh,
yeah. And so he was desperate because this is a very important, crucial debate. And of course, if he pulled out of it, they would have said, they didn't want to argue. And so he prayed all night to St. Agnes, and in the wee hours of the morning, the infected tooth just fell from his gums, and the swelling went down, and he could speak. And he was able to give his disputation. And ever after that, throughout his life, he kept the tooth as a souvenir, and he would show it to people as evidence of the power of St. Agnes's intercession.
Isn't that
wonderful? So I love that because, St. Thomas, the most lofty of theologians.
I know, you think of him up here, ethereal, just the brain.
But he had the simple, concrete faith of any ordinary Christian in the relics of the saints, in their intercession, and the marvels they work for us. And then he would show them the tooth as the evidence of it. And this is extremely charming. And so it makes you love St. Thomas more and gives you a better perspective on his what fired his theological understanding.
It doesn't make me love Thomas more. It makes me love Thomas Aquinas. Thomas More is a complete... I don't know if you know that.
More as in more than less.
I couldn't resist, Father.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
One of the things you always hear back when you talk about redefining marriage is people will say, well, it's not hurting anybody, so what's your problem with it? What do you think the best response to that is to show that it is hurting people and how they're hurt?
Well, honestly, people say that about every part of the sexual revolution. It's not really hurting anybody. It's not hurting you. So why should you care what somebody else is doing? So, for example, people kind of said, well, how does my divorce affect your marriage? Children will be fine. It's not that big of a deal. The kids are fine after divorce. They get over it. They move on. And your marriage is fine and solid. How could my divorce possibly affect you? Well, that's what people said back in the day. And of course, now when we look around us, we can see that it actually does matter quite a bit. That the understanding of human community that says I'm not hurting you because my divorce is just happening here in my house and it doesn't have any spillover effects. That's a very naive view of how a social order works. I mean, and I'll just give you one example on that particular issue, Michael. I was talking to a friend of mine who's about my age, and she was talking about how when she was a teenager, her parents were professors at a university. I forget what university it was. And they decided to experiment with open marriage, say, back in the 60s and the 70s. Her parents decided to do this experiment. And she, my friend and her brothers and sisters are like, what the heck's going on? So her parents are having an open marriage. One of her parents, they get divorced, and one of them marries another friend, another professor. And so that marriage breaks up. And then that spare spouse goes and has an affair with yet another spouse in the same circle of friends. And so what ended up happening is that whole little community, everybody ended up divorced, And so when you say that marriage is structurally going to be an impermanent institution, you kind of turn everybody loose, right? And so it does have spillover effects. And honestly, that's what I do in a lot of the sexual state. A lot of this book, Michael, I spend a lot of the time in here really showing the different ways that my sexual activity does turn out to affect other people. And the structures and the rules that we have around things, those structures and rules do affect other people. So that's the general point. And then the gay marriage issue is one instance of that more general point, which is that when you create a society where you say children don't really have a right to their parents, you've said something quite profound, that some children have a legally recognized right to know both of their parents, and other children don't. That's quite a profound thing to say, and it does affect everybody. So that's the way I would go with it, and I would not be afraid, Michael, when you're talking to people about these issues, do not be afraid to bring up the other topics where we have many more years of experience and can say for sure the church is right. It may be a little soon to say, what is gay marriage going to do to all of society? But it's not too soon to say that divorce has been a mess. It's not too soon to say that. We have plenty of evidence on that point.
How does that strike you, Michael?
That's great. Thanks for the information. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much. Something that, as you go through these three kind of the contraceptive ideology, the divorce ideology, and then the gender ideology, all connected into this one overarching thing we can call the sexual revolution.
Right.
In what way would you say, because you say the state is used as an instrument of power to kind of promote these because reason won't do it. You can't reason your way to think, hey, a society where most marriages fail, that's the kind of society we want. You're never going to reason your way to that. That makes no sense. So how does government actually encourage or promote the divorce ideology?
Well, divorce is actually the most obvious one to see because the underlying idea, and it's important to see the underlying idea, the thing people are trying to get to when they create these ideologies. I mean, I think the fantasy that people have is kids are so resilient that it doesn't matter what we do as adults. We can partner and repartner and pair up and, break up and reconfigure our relationships, and the kids will be fine because they're so resilient. Now, we adults, we're so fragile. We have to have our love lives exactly the way we want them or we'll go to pieces. But the kids are going to be fine. It's all good. That's the underlying fantasy, right?
Yes.
That is trying to be achieved. And so the way the government has promoted the divorce ideology is really very simple, Cy. What no-fault divorce says, no-fault divorce is actually a misnomer, I would say. What it really should be called is unilateral divorce. Because what no-fault divorce says is that one party can end the marriage for any reason or no reason, and the government will always take sides with the person who wants the marriage the least. See, that's the point people don't get. The government always takes sides with the person who doesn't want to stay married. That's not neutral. That's a big thing. That's a big thumb on the scale of pushing people towards impermanence and towards non-sexual exclusivity. See, that's the other thing that no-fault divorce does, Cy, is it's not just that marriage is not permanent anymore. Marriage is also not sexually exclusive. because adultery used to be like the number one fault, right? That's a marital fault. You're in trouble. You can't do that. Well, now, heck, you can do that. The adulterer gets whatever they want.
Because what used to carry consequences with it now no longer carries consequences before a judge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sadly, I'm going to say this and probably get in a lot of trouble, but I don't care. Sadly, Catholic divorce is not that different from civil divorce. You know, that so many people look at the annulment process as if it is simply Catholic divorce, and they anticipate. Sometimes, I mean, I hear these stories all the time. So, you know, when you put yourself out there in the public, like I've put myself out there, people tell me things, you know. And one of the stories I've heard repeatedly is people dissolving long-standing marriages, you know, 20, 30-year marriages, because, you know, one spouse decides that she doesn't want to be married anymore, and she finds a priest who says, "Oh, honey, you've got grounds for annulment. It'll be fine." And the kids are sitting there going, "What? You weren't married all this time?" The husband's like, "What? What just happened here?" You know, and so the church has succumbed to the times in that respect, I would say, you know, because honestly, you've been together 30 years, you had 7 children, it's not really a marriage. Hey, how about we convalidate this union? Let's make it so it's valid, okay? You're grown up now. Let's do it. Let's take care of it. But nobody ever thinks of that. No, it's divorce, divorce, divorce. You know, annulment, annulment, annulment. Move on to the next spouse. You know, come on, people. We got to do better than that.
Jimmy, throughout the history of the church, we have all these pairs of people, Cyril and Methodius, and all of a sudden they all just went out of my mind, but Perpetua and Felicity, and an early, in the Christian tradition, an early one that gets paired in our minds is Timothy and Titus.
Yeah.
So let's unpair them. Let's take them one at a time.
Oh, hey, what God has joined together, let man not separate.
And well, they weren't married.
No, that's true.
But they do in our consciousness they're together. So maybe first of all, why? Why do we think of Timothy and Titus together?
Well, they're the two individuals to whom Paul wrote the major pastoral letters. The pastoral letters are so called because they're written to pastors instead of to churches. Yeah. And so Timothy is one of those pastors. Titus is the other. They're also kind of paired with another letter called Philemon, which isn't quite a pastor. It's not the same kind of letter. Yeah. But because they had these two letters written to them, they're very prominent in the Bible, and that's the principal reason that we think of the two of them together. And they share a common liturgical day on the calendar as a result.
January 26th.
I
looked it up before the show. So let's start with Timothy, if we can. I find him a fascinating New Testament figure because we know his mother's name.
Yeah.
And I think we know his grandmother's name, but
we do.
Oh, yeah, okay. So they were... Who were his?
Oh, you want me to tell you?
Yeah,
okay,
Eunice.
yeah. So his mother was Eunice, which is a great name because it means good victory in Greek.
Nice. Okay.
And his grandmother was named Lois.
And they were Christians.
Yes, they were Christians. They were also Jews.
Okay. And where were they from?
They were from Lystra. Lystra is a town in Galatia. City in Galatia, it's in part of modern Turkey. But if you ever hear, at Mass, you'll hear the letter to the Galatians written, and it's written to the churches of Galatia. Okay, and so those are cities like Lystra, Iconium, Derbe, and Timothy was from there, so he was a Galatian. When Paul was taking the Galatians to task, he's taken Timothy's own home area to task.
So, and what about his father? Do we know his father? Or no?
We know his father was a Greek, but beyond that, we don't know anything about his father.
So, how does Timothy end up?
So his parents had a mixed marriage.
One a Christian, but this was very, very early in Christian history. So she was a convert?
She would have been a convert to the Christian faith. Paul reached Lystra on the second missionary journey.
Okay.
There may have been others who reached there beforehand. It seems that Timothy was one of Paul's own converts because he later calls him his son.
Okay, and so sometime then in the 40s, Timothy is converted to Christianity?
50s.
In the 50s, okay.
Well, late could have been late 49, something like that.
And then he kind of becomes an assistant to Paul.
Yeah. Paul is on the second missionary journey, and he meets Timothy in process as he's going. And Timothy has such a good reputation that Paul decides to take him with him on the trip, and to finish the rest of the missionary journey with him. And this meant a huge sacrifice on Timothy's part. And I don't just mean he had to sacrifice time.
I know what you're referring to.
Yeah, it's really ironic. The second missionary journey occurs right after the Acts 15 council, where it was decided circumcision is not necessary for Gentiles.
Right.
And so Luke actually says in Acts that they're bringing the letter from the Jerusalem council to show it to all of the churches about how Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. So what does Paul do when he wants to take Timothy with him? He circumcises him. And Luke explains that by saying, because everybody knew his father was a Greek. So apparently Paul wanted Timothy to be able to minister in Jewish circles. And in order to be accepted in Jewish circles, he needed to be fully Jewish. And so he gets circumcised, even though they've just decided that's not necessary.
Eventually, Paul has to write him a letter. So where does he end up?
Well, he ends up, at the time of that letter, of 1 Timothy, he is in Ephesus. Ephesus was a place that Paul had spent a lot of time in, but he left Timothy at one point there in the AD 60s to do pastoral work. This is maybe around AD 65. He also writes Timothy another letter just as he's about to die. Probably in late 66, he writes him another letter. It's really touching because he knows he's at the end of his life. He's talking about the fact that he's going to die soon. And he tells Timothy to come if you can at all possible before winter when the travel season shut down. And because he really wants to see him. And he says, bring me my books and my cloak. And
it's very personal.
Yeah.
All right, next time we'll talk a little bit about Titus.
Okay.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thanks for watching Catholic Answers Live TV. Join us each weekday from 3 to 5 Pacific and 6 to 8 Eastern for our live radio broadcast on EWTN Radio. Or join us on the EWTN app. Find more videos and live streams on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/CatholicCom. Or find us on Facebook simply by searching Catholic Answers. Jesus Christ is the light of the nations, and we'll see you next week on Catholic Answers Live TV.